Thanks, guys, for tuning in and watching. My name's Christy. I'm one of the founders at Subdial, and we're here today to talk about the Big Watch Survey. It's the first year that we've run it, and the Big Watch Survey aims to be the collector's voice in the watch industry, looking at watch releases of the year, what reissues people are looking forward in the following year in 2025. And also looking at kind of people's views on brands. Are they getting more or less into Omega or Rolex, and how are tastes changing over the year? Super excited today and lucky to have Tony Traina join us. Thanks so much, Tony, for joining this.
Christy, Subdial team, thanks first of all for doing this survey. It was fun to sort of comb through some of the results, and then obviously thanks for having me. Excited to get into some of them.
Awesome. Well, I mean, you were good enough to actually take the survey, and I haven't pulled your individual results out for publishing here. But as you'll know, there was a ton of different stuff in there, and I guess what I wanted to do today was to really drill into, one specific area, and we'll see where the conversation goes. We might branch out from there. But I know that you've got a penchant, soft spot for Cartier as a brand. And it really felt like amazing results for Cartier within this survey. So, a couple of the questions that we asked collectors about. So one was which brands they thought had either a good or a bad year across 2024. And also we asked people which brands they either hadn't been interested in before, but are now interested in, or had been interested in and are now not interested in. So where are kind of people moving? And Cartier really shone through that. They were the highest voted brand on the brands that people have become more interested in. So actually around 18% of all people who voted said they'd become more interested in Cartier, having not been interested in the brand before across the year. They were the lowest voted for brands that people thought had a bad year in 2024. So it really feels like it's having a moment. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, it's funny. I was going through some of my old articles to just think about the Cartier trend. And I think the first article I wrote for HODINKEE before I even was a full-time employee there was naming the Cartier Crash the quote unquote vintage watch of the year. And that was in 2021. So it's been a slow build. It started with the Cartier Crash in many ways as like this trend setting watch, this halo product of a watch, or this hero product that has really emanated throughout the rest of the brand. As you mentioned, I think it started as this real collector driven or enthusiast driven type of trend focused on these high end collectors pieces. But the reality is the name recognition and the brand recognition for Cartier has always been there, perhaps surpassed only by Rolex. It has the biggest name recognition of any luxury brand that makes watches in the entire world. I would be so bold as to say. And they have figured out in the past almost decade now, going back to when they changed leadership, and I think it was 2016 or 2017, how to refocus on their heritage, on shapes, on the things that they do well, and getting away from some of the things that they weren't doing as well in the early 2010s. And it ended up sort of just aligning correctly with the way in which sort of broader trends have come to be. These trends that we like to talk about smaller watches, dress watches, that I'm kind of skeptical as to how much they are actually trends or how much just sort of the industry is talking about it in these little echo chambers that we like to discuss such things in on social media or wherever else. But it's the year that it really feels like Cartier broke through and became this mainstream thing where I get questions about Cartier as much from friends that aren't really into watches, that are just looking to buy these standard watches that I would almost call more commercial watches, like a Tank Americain, a Cartier Panther, your standard Cartier Tank Solos, or anything else throughout the Tank line that aren't these collector's watches at the Privé line or the Crash level that we like to think about and talk about a lot, but just these standard commercial watches that anyone can walk into their Cartier boutique and have a nice glass of champagne as they look at and potentially buy. And it seems like they really broke through on that level in 2024.
Yeah, that was something I was going to ask you about, actually, because, similar to you, I mean, I remember kind of 4 years ago or so, there was the CPCP moment, the collection privé, that really took, the collector the collector community by storm, and people suddenly went. I think it was actually really in the wake of Jean, and as Jean started to grow, people started to kind of go back through his history and realize that he was a watchmaker at Cartier within that kind of beautiful 98 to 2008 period, and started. I think it galvanized some kind of renewed interest in I guess a brand that previously within the collector community had kind of been seen more as like a jewelry brand than a watch brand. But I mean, that was kind of 4 years ago, and here we are, 4 years on. Cartier is now, I think, the second biggest, brand in terms of Swiss exports behind Rolex. And I think one of the results that really stood out for me within this survey was actually when you look at those questions that I talked about earlier. So which brands are people becoming more interested in or less interested in? The people who are becoming more interested in Cartier, the brands that they're coming from, number one within that was Bremont. So 12.3% of those people who said, I'm becoming more interested in Cartier, they were saying that I'm becoming less interested in Bremont. And I used to be interested in Bremont, but now I'm becoming less interested. It was followed by Rolex, but there was also Breitling, there was Tag Heuer, IWC, Omega, Hublot. These were all really high up there. So I guess it asked this question of like, where are we within the Cartier growth story, right? Because it feels like it's cut through from the upper echelon of collectability down to, much more everyday collectors.
Yeah, well, first of all, I think that says more about Bremont than Cartier probably. But if you think about it more broadly, like where else, the brands that you mentioned are the brands that even just take up a lot of the mind share of the watch industry in general are kind of known for steel and sports watch, right? The things that have been the focus of the industry for the past like 15 years. And it's kind of like, where else would Cartier pull from? If they were pulling from, let's say, like for like, there's not a ton of watch brands that are really known for being these makers of slim, elegant dress watches. You can say Patek and the Calatrava on some level, but even the standard Patek Calatrava is quite large proposition nowadays. The standards 6119 and 6007. So if you want something slimmer, a little bit more elegant, Cartier is the real option. So I think even more so than pulling from any particular brand, it just represents the fact that uh, it's pulling mind share from the steel sports watch vibe, I think, on some level. And people are looking for maybe it's not even an alternative to a Bremont or Rolex, Breitling, whatever else, but another watch in addition to the steel sports watch that they already have, right? I think that's perhaps what's happening as much as anything. People are realizing that there's room for both in their collection or watch drawer or whatever it is, and there's only sort of so many dive watches, chronographs, whatever that you can have that really makes sense to have in one collection.
And do you think, I mean, so, I look back across 2024, there's brands like Berneron that we talked about just before we kind of started recording this, that are, doing fantastically well amongst collectors. You've got the Exequo Dali kind of melting watch. It feels like there's a bit of a kind of moment, right, around
Not the soft watch. Oh no.
Yeah, just the soft watch, right? But
I put that in the same category as like
it's not, yeah,
and Cartier,
But from a kind of I guess design perspective, right? There's a kind of move towards not equating these things. But I mean, even like the Anoma, right? The kind of A1. There's this move towards I guess dress pieces that are design led with interesting case shapes. And I guess how much do we look at this, what's going on with Cartier at the minute, and think that it's a fad, right? Or it's at least trend led, right? And it's related to a trend that happens to be going on at the minute, versus it's a kind of full blown return to kind of greatness from a watchmaking perspective for Cartier.
Yeah, I think first of all, I think some of it is people realizing there's room for both design driven and more functionality driven watches. But I do think when I cover some of these design driven watches, let's say some of the watches that you just lumped in the broader design driven category, which I think is relatively fair to do, I suppose. I try to think about whether or not there's something more there. Like if the founder, the creator is trying to say something more broadly, provide an actual point of view. Berneron is obviously like the easiest one to explain here because he's doing this full gold movement and the shape actually follows from the movement and doing the asymmetrical movement that allowed him to have, a thinner watch and smaller watch that actually sort of matches the dressy, elegant proportions that a brand like Cartier or Patek would have been known for 50, 70, 80 years ago. So I do push back a little bit on the idea of like, look at all these cool, fun case shapes, right? I try to think about ones that are doing something a little bit more. Because I've seen some crappy ones, honestly. I've got a couple of them sitting over here on my windowsill, if I'm being honest, watches that are kind of trying to take advantage of certain trends with things like shapes and stone dials and aren't necessarily like well-made watches or thoughtful in any broader sense, but they feel like a bit of a cash grab if we're being honest. So I do think some of it's obviously trend led, and what happens during any trend is there's a lot of there's an influx of ideas, some of which are not good, some of which are trying to take advantage of the trend, but in a year's time when all of that flushes out, some of the good stuff will still be standing. And I think Cartier is an enduring brand that has, stood the test of time for whatever it's been, 150, 175 years, and will continue to. Is the hype a little bit unsustainable on some of these higher end models? Perhaps, but I think Cartier is always going to be, one of the 2 to 5 biggest Swiss watch brands in the world.
Yeah, no, don't get me wrong. I mean, there's clearly difference in execution and sincerity, between some of these brands and what they're doing. But it does feel like there is a trend towards smaller watches, towards I guess the opposite of sports watches in a way, right? In every single way, and perhaps the way of understanding those. Or just understanding that kind of movement is to accept that like people are recognizing there's a space for both in a collection, right? And there's a space for more, for a kind of breadth of design and a breadth of kind of watch model within one's collection. But I mean, it's something that, we sit here and I guess we're kind of interfacing with collectors every single day and have done for the last, 5 years since we started the company. And one thing that, I think is just plainly obvious to me during that time is the speed at which trends are appearing within the watch community is just getting quicker and quicker and quicker. And I think on the whole, that's, a fantastic thing. I first started Subdial, really the pinnacle of collectability was around vintage Rolex. And I say that as somebody who's wearing a vintage Rolex, and it was about arguing around, Mark 1 or Mark 2 dials and, small serif font changes. And really that's just kind of exploded, right? And I think particularly, started around neo-vintage, which felt like a kind of pretty unexplored and misunderstood sort of area of watchmaking or time period of watchmaking. But it feels like, there's this community of people who are just incredibly interested in finding new things and finding new stories that haven't been told before. And the speed of those trends that are coming off of those is just getting faster and faster and faster. And I think, absolutely, there's no part of me that's starting to or trying to suggest that Cartier is an overnight fad sensation that isn't going to be around, tomorrow. But it does feel like there's a new kind of speed of trend that, Cartier is riding the crest of at the minute when it comes to kind of jewelry style watches.
Yeah, I think regarding the speed of trends, it's an interesting question that you bring up. I mean, this is just the nature of media, I think, nowadays. Like, things just move faster on Instagram than they did on forums or internet blogs or whatever else. And um, it's almost not worth arguing about whether or not that's good or bad. That's just the way things are, right? I like watches on some level because there's these enduring objects that hopefully stand the test of time and all of that type of stuff. I don't need to wax too poetical here. You get it, Christy. Um, but I think that it's the good thing about the speed in which it's moving is I think collectors, there's just more information out there that's easily accessible. So collectors, enthusiasts that are really into it have gotten better about discerning what's real and what's not and having the information at their fingertips to pretty quickly, like, when dealers or commercial interests or whatever it is start saying neo vintage is the new hot thing or independent watchmaking is the new hot thing, Cartier is, whatever it might be, pretty quickly we're able to suss out what's actually good and what's actually bad about that. I mean, you were talking about the FP Journe connection to the Cartier Tortue monopusher, the CPCP one from 1998 or whatever it was, right? That was one of the first Cartiers to have a moment, I feel like, in the late 2010s before the broader Cartier moment. And I think that was that was one of the things that actually made me look at the CPCP line more broadly. And people understand that that's a high quality era of watchmaking, when kind of like what they're doing with the Privé collection now. Cartier got back to their roots and was outsourcing Piaget movements, or working with watchmakers like Journe or whoever else to make really quality watches in their classical shapes. And I think we've seen that sort of scholarship, to use kind of an overly used term, across every kind of trend or supposed trend as it kind of crops up in the industry, which it seems like happens almost every day.
Yeah, and I think that's right. I mean, it's interesting that you say, these trends that are, perpetuated by dealers, right, and kind of traders who are saying like, oh, this is the next new thing. I mean, it's really interesting, right? So I might have a
I
vested
wasn't
interest
blaming
in.
you, Christy.
No,
I
no,
was
no,
saying
no, no.
generally.
I might have a vested interest in, but I actually think one of the most amazing things about this industry is that often that the movements that you see, or the kind of trends and the changes in behavior, are collector led, right? Because you get people who are just so passionate about this world, that actually they're doing the research themselves, right? It doesn't just require industry professionals to be like digging up those interesting stories. Actually, a lot of the time it's kind of collectors who in any other walk of life would kind of say that it's almost like a second job, the amount of like research and deep dive investigation that they're doing around watches, but they're doing it purely for fun and enjoyment. I think it's one of the best things about the industry.
Yeah, I have a general belief that the media landscape and the way in which watch collecting works nowadays is just too disparate for anyone to really create a trend, whether it be like HODINKEE or a famous TikTok or a famous dealer, whatever it is. It has to be more or less organic, and people can try. But as we were just talking about, collectors on the whole are smart enough, or the market on the whole is smart enough to suss out whether or not something is real, something is has legitimate value to the watchmaking world. And I think that kind of happens every day. So I think that's really exciting to see. I've always been sort of skeptical to the fact of whether or not like anyone can really drive a particular trend. So I think it's good when people like try to surface these things, and then the market kind of decides whether or not they're actually worth pursuing, and the market value goes up, down, whatever it is. It's fun to sort of watch for sure.
So one question I wanted to ask you about in relation to Cartier then is, how much it feels like there's, real innovation going on within the brand. I mean, it feels like they've certainly recognized that there is an incredible history and story that they can tell around, the past kind of 50 years of watchmaking beyond. They've done a lot of reissues, right? We've got the Centre, the Crash, the Tonneau, the Asymmetric, the Cloche, the Tortue in 2024. So there's a lot of kind of reissues, and I think they're kind of saying they're going to continue, right? Like one a year, just keep kind of reissuing these models. Actually, the Tanker Guichet came out as the most in demand. It won the kind of highest votes on the watch that people want to see reissued for people who work in the industry within this survey. So 15.2% of people within the watch industry said that the Tanker Guichet was what they wanted to see. So there's obviously a lot of success in, calling on that history, looking at that extreme amount of kind of innovation that they did in terms of, different watches and different shapes and different designs in the past. But actually, I kind of wonder whether that risk-taking is still there today. It feels to me like a lot of the innovation that they're doing actually is within their kind of ladies, quote unquote, range. The Libra watch collection, feels like it's actually playing with design in a much more interesting way that they're not doing more broadly. But yeah, I don't know how kind of. I guess what I'm asking is, does it feel like actually the innovation that makes Cartier Cartier is still there today, or does it feel like they're kind of resting on their laurels a little bit?
Yeah, innovation is probably not the word, but it is a evolution, I think, of Cartier. To take just the monopusher for this year that they released, for example, it's a subtle evolution of what they did in the 1990s, right? The movement is now shaped, which is nice to see, shaped to the case. If your entire brand is shapes, that's probably something important for you to do. They also had the what's it called, the Santos Dumont Rewind this year, right? I mean, that's a fun little thing to do. Is it groundbreaking innovation? Probably not, but who else is doing that, right? It's a sort of subtle evolution of the Santos Dumont that is really cool. Makes you think about time in a way that perhaps not every brand is like whimsical enough to do. So I think there are these subtle evolutions and takes that they have on their watches that are interesting. That said, you're right. The Privé collection in general, these sort of high end collectors watches that they release in limited editions every year, it's somewhat formulaic, right? In the sense that we know they're going to take an old shape, pluck it from the archives, and introduce it in a couple of new metals and limited runs. Last year, for example, the Cartier Tank Normal had a beautiful bracelet on it. The Tortue, though, had the mono pusher movement. So there are things they do to continue to push themselves forward, which is nice to see. That said, it's obviously an analog to the CPCP collection that they ran from 1998 to 2008, I think. So that was a decade. I guess that they after that they felt like it had run its course, or the industry had moved on, and they kind of focused on complications and complicated watchmaking after that for a little bit, and kind of lost their way, if we're being honest. And I am curious how much longer the Privé collection has, because it started in 2017, I believe, and they've kind of run through some of the more popular shapes in their back catalog. So I'll be curious to see sort of where it goes in the future, but I think we've got at least a few good years left, and there's still a handful of shapes or designs, some of which you just mentioned there, the guichet, for example, that would be fun to see come back on some level.
Yeah, it's interesting in the Watch of the Year results that we got in the survey. So the top 3 spaces got filled by the White Dial Speedmaster in number 1. You had the new GMT Master 2 with the grey black, and you had the green dial yellow gold Vacheron Constantin Overseas in 3rd place. And I guess what really stood out to me in that is just the enduring kind of appeal, for collectors of old favorites with a slight twist. And I think, whilst we can, really want to see, more extreme innovation from brands, actually, when it comes down to it, a lot of collectors, I think what they really like to see is something that they know they like with a slight twist on it.
Yep. I think we push these brands so much, Rolex, Cartier, whoever else. So we shout and scream every year at Watches and Wonders. It's like you could set your watch to it. This is going to happen in April 2025. That Rolex is boring. Cartier didn't do anything. Vacheron, Patek on down the line aren't doing anything exciting. But that's kind of the point, right? Like they have these enduring models, shapes, whatever it is, that people want. And I think if they stray too much from that, then they're not. Again, this is what I like about watches. They have these enduring things that are not seasonal. It's not like a fashion collection where they release one twice a season, and you feel as though you have to go get the hot new thing. Like the hot new thing is a slight variation on a bezel color. I kind of like that. I try not to engage in all of this discourse about how there's no innovation in the watch industry, or how these watch brands are boring. At least I do think we can push them in terms of innovation, as you're saying. But in terms of changing things that are core to their collection, I don't think they necessarily need to be doing that.
How much, when you look at, so we're sitting here at the end of 2024, we're looking back and we're saying, it's been a great year for Cartier. It's been, a less good year for Bremont and Hublot. And I think, there are, brands in there that you can point at and you can say there were clear mistakes that were made, or you can point out and you can say there were clear, successes and, real decisions that were made that contributed to that success. If you look at something like Cartier's success over the last 12 months, how much should we, credit, the current, management and leadership within Cartier for that? And how much should we look at it and just say, actually it's a kind of moment, right? Like we can credit Cartier for the history that they've got and, all of the watchmaking that's gone before, but actually what's happening now is kind of slightly out of their control.
Yeah, it's the classic question, right? Like how much of our success, your success, my success, anyone's success is luck versus hard work. And I think it's the same with some of these brands, right? For Cartier, it's happened to time up with the way in which trends have worked in the past few years towards all of the things that we've been discussing. And they happen to be the brand best positioned to take advantage of that. At the same time, they were the ones that put themselves to be in that position back in 2016, 2017. When I mentioned they started the Privé line, when they really started to refocus on dress watches and their heritage and all these things. They were doing that almost a decade ago now, before that was the trend. I mean, you were talking about it just a second ago in 2016, 2017. That's when vintage Rolex was the hottest thing in the world. Paul Newman's Rolex had just been sold for $17 million. It probably felt insane at Cartier to be like, you know what, we're going to focus on precious metal, gold, platinum watches again, and we're going to get away from the Cartier Roadster and whatever else their sort of sports watches are, and focus on these types of things. That said, they do have some of that type of stuff down in the catalog. If you want the steel version of some of these things, that's available, but it all feels like it comes from some of the higher end stuff that you see on collectors, enthusiasts, celebrities' wrists. So they were the ones that positioned themselves to do this on product, on marketing, on everything. And then when the trend happened to move in their direction, which it's a pretty sure bet that that will always happen on at some point. Trends are pretty cyclical, and there's only so many ways to make a watch, I think. It was pretty sure it was going to happen eventually, but they positioned themselves to take advantage of that when it did happen.
Yeah, I think the right answer is always skill and hard work when it's our success, and luck when it's somebody else. So that's what I'm going for.
That's right. That's right.
And
That's
so,
right.
looking to 2025, any rumors, anything that you've heard, about what we can expect from Cartier over the next 12 months?
Nothing I've heard yet. Let me think about this.
Things you have heard. Yeah. Things that you have heard. Oh, right, okay.
No, I haven't heard anything, actually.
What you'd like to see?
I'd like to see from Cartier. Stay the course. The tanky Hachet is a good idea. My big bugaboo that I've always complained about with Cartier is that they don't have the most classic standard Cartier in the entire world is a yellow gold Cartier tank in the classic size or close to the classic size. They've upped it just a little bit with a manual movement, and they just don't have that right now. You can't walk into Cartier and say to the clerk there or the SA there, I'd like the yellow gold tank that Andy Warhol, Muhammad Ali, whoever was wearing, because they don't really offer that in yellow gold with a manual wind movement. And I think that should be available in the way a Rolex Submariner is available. It's essentially the dress version of the Rolex Submariner, in my opinion. So I think that they should probably do that.
Well, hopefully they're watching and listening. And if we see that in 2025 or 2026, then I think yours to credit, Tony, on that one. Awesome. Hey, well, I've taken up enough of your time, so thanks so much. I'm going to let you get back to Lapland, it looks like. Thanks so much for agreeing to come on and share your wisdom, Tony. I really appreciate it.
That's right. Thank you so much for having me, and thanks again for doing this survey. It was a lot of fun.
Great. Thanks so much. That was awesome.